there's some massive changes.
Yeah. I feel like in the moment we're in, people are getting awakened to the way some actors have corrupted our institutions and our systems, and they're not working for people.
Of all the things that have happened in the last 25 years, the pollution of childhood is the one that concerns me the most. My friend said of his son, he feels robbed because he feels like he's growing up in a world where he has nothing to believe in. I think we have become over-ideologized, and that worries me. People who are leaders need to be really, really intentional about what their story. Having that kind of identity just is so crucial, I think, for helping people understand their place in the world. The paradox of what's happening right now in religious circles is people are abandoning faith at exactly the moment when I would argue that it's more important than ever.
Malcolm Gladwell, welcome to UnderCurrent.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to sit down
Gabe, it's good to be back.
Yeah, it's just
How
good
many years has it been since I was...
Man, the first time you spoke at one of our events was a decade ago.
Is that right?
Yeah, you helped us launch, you might not remember this, but it was our second time doing it where we had hundreds of cities all over the world hosting our Commons event. We now call it THINQ Local. Yeah. And essentially these leaders bring together people to have great conversations. And it's amazing to look forward now to see how important that's become. Like, it's now essential to build the fabric of these communities, and churches are hosting those. And so you're part of that, and you've been with us many times to just help bring really good insight, and this community's loved hearing from you. So thanks for sitting down and having this conversation.
Not at all.
You're revisiting in your latest book, The Tipping Point, which I think a lot of people, that was the first time they'd heard your work. And then now this new book, The Revenge of the Tipping Point. It's so interesting as you've had 25 years to reflect on these ideas of how ideas spread. And that's so important in the work we do, because we know ideas matter and the way that they find people matters. And oftentimes we think it's completely by chance. And sometimes it's actually not by chance. It's very intentional. And you start to underscore that, I believe, throughout this book. It was really helpful to read. But I want you to, as an author, just give a little reflection on 25 years in to that tipping point journey and looking back at it. What was that like for you to just take a new look at work you had done? And were there some things you just were like, I should have never written that? Or did it validate? You're like, no, this was pretty good. It's
a little painful. It's like looking at your high school yearbook. It's that experience. Because I don't reread things once I write them. So I really hadn't read it in 25 years. And so, it's like I say, it's the yearbook experience. It's like, wow, I look really young, and wait, what was I wearing? It was that combination of, it was written in a very different era. I feel like I was in my 30s when I wrote that book. It was my first book. I was a relatively unknown person. I had no idea what it meant to write a book. And I was super kind of optimistic, because I think it was a very optimistic time. And then coming back 25 years later, I feel a little more world weary, I think. I'm a little less, not that I've never been a pessimist, but I'm just a little more aware of the ways in which ideas can be used in a way that's not positive.
Yeah.
And I think also I tell stories in different ways. I mean, this book is much more story focused. I'm much more interested in people and their stories and character and that kind of thing than I was when I was a kid, when I was in my 30s.
I think part of when I first discovered you, I was in my 20s too, and trying to navigate and understand the world and how it worked. And we were setting off on this vision of really wanting to see the Christian faith regain some traction in society. And when you're young, you're ambitious. You're like, this can happen. You believe it. And then as time goes on, you're like, man, this could take a really long time. Like, I think what I was encouraged by in reading The Revenge of the Tipping Point is that every one of us has small contributions we can make to seeing change happen in the world. And we often don't know that the little thing that we're doing actually could be the thing, like the tipping point. It could be the thing, and we just don't know. But it does require hope. It requires this dream in front of us, a possibility that if we do get cynical, perhaps we stop trying. So as you came through this journey, I know your encouragement at the end of this project is to say, hey, little things can make a big difference. But speak to the need for hope.
Yeah, the thing you were just saying, there's a point in the book when I'm talking about, excuse me, just before the Berlin Wall falls, before the Soviet Empire collapses, there were all these people who had intimate knowledge of what was going on in Eastern Europe. You know, the Russian, the Soviet government, peace activists behind the wall, the CIA, you know, nobody predicted what was going to happen. They all, you know, it was a surprise to everyone. It was even a surprise to the people who were actively fighting to overturn the Soviet Empire. And that idea that we're somehow, they were really, 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 really close, the people who were fighting for freedom in Eastern Europe, really, really close to victory and had no idea they were close to victory. I find that a really interesting notion. And I suspect that is true of all kinds of different movements. There's something about us that, whether it's a kind of inherent pessimism or whether we have this kind of notion that change is linear, that there's no alternative to doing it one step at a time, and you get out what you put in, right?
Yeah.
And we forget that there are moments when suddenly the return on investment of time and energy and imagination is 10x, not
right.
1x. There's something about us that never sees that, right? Mm-hmm. And there's numerous examples. I mean, I have the chapter in my book on the debate over marriage equality, gay marriage in this country, which was, I mean, regardless of your feelings about it, it was a huge political issue, and then it was not.
Right.
And even the people fighting for it didn't realize it was going to go. They thought they were in for a 50-year battle. Yeah. And it was a 10-year battle.
Well, you described, I mean, it was a constitutional amendment, right?
Yeah.
For marriage in 2005, I think.
In 2005, if you were involved in that fight, you thought it was over. I mean, the politics everyone had lined up against you. They were losing state after state. President Bush was calling for a constitutional amendment to outlaw it, and then it just went away.
Yeah.
Right. And I just think there's something about that that's really important, that our intuitive judgments about change and about how ideas spread are flawed. And we need to remember that. And that, I think, internalizing that fact is what can keep us hopeful.
Yeah. I know from my faith perspective sometimes, and if you throw a sociological lens over it, I don't know that this would ever add up because it's a very faith-oriented perspective. But that, hey, when we do good things, when we're part of doing what we sense God's calling us to do, that there's an opportunity that through Him these things spread, right? And I know there's no way to research or scientifically prove that, but I think for a lot of Christians, that hope is what keeps us moving forward in the world to say, hey, we need to keep redeeming things that are broken. We need to be part of renewal. Like, this is our calling. This is what we do in life. So we don't necessarily know if it's going to keep going up and to the right. It might go down a little bit, but that personal intrinsic motivation is really coming from a faith perspective. Do you see that in your work at all?
It was funny. When you were talking, I was thinking about, Jesus feeding the multitudes with the loaves and the fishes, and everybody says, you don't have enough food, right? They're making that kind of linear judgment. They're looking at what is in front of them, and they're saying, and they're extrapolating, and they're saying, I don't see how you get from A to B here, Jesus. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is like, well, maybe I have more imagination than you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's the same. I think the meaning of that story is exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Is our expectations about what is possible are constrained. They're constrained by a lack of faith. They're constrained by any number of things. But fundamentally, we should not, bank too much on these kinds of intuitions we have about how change works.
Yeah, that's good. Do you think, if you look back when you wrote The Tipping Point, is there any chance that you'd bought into the myth of progress? Just the idea that linearly, as things go forward, things just do get better. We get smarter, more intelligent, better technology. Mm-hmm. And as you look back now, it's like, it just doesn't quite work out that way?
It's funny. I think if I had to put my finger on the difference that being older has made, is that now that I'm older, I have become much more kind of skeptical of the idea that things move inexorably forward. For example, if you'd asked me at 35, when I didn't have a lot of money, if my life would be greatly improved by having whatever, twice as much money, I would have said sure. But now that actually happened,
Yeah.
I don't think my life is better. I mean, it's different.
Yeah.
I've traded one set of concerns for another, but I don't see.
Yeah.
There's a kind of naivete I think you have as a young person entering your career, where you see this kind of clear, straight line towards kind of satisfaction and happiness. Mm-hmm. And as you get older, you realize it's not a straight line. It can be a kind of now that I have kids, the fact of my own kind of personal prosperity worries me more than it reassures me.
Yeah.
I worry what that will mean for them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a reflective look. I mean, when you wrote Tipping Point, this was pre 9/11.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so the world has dramatically changed in those 25 years. The COVID situation takes place in 2020. You see a mental health crisis start to spin out of control with our youth. Mm-hmm. You assume a phone, a digital device is going to be, it's good for us. We get all this, thousands of years of technology in the palm of our hand. But now, I don't know, Jonathan Haidt's work, Anxious Generation, has been, really helpful, informative for a lot of people to rethink our relationship with the device. But those are the examples I'm seeing where when I look at our kids, like you can tell a lot by society by how your children are doing. I don't know if you read a lot or like Neil Postman. He's somebody I've appreciated, but he has this book, Building a Bridge to the 18th Century, where he essentially argues that the 1700s was when humans were flourishing the most. And it's ironic because you're like, really? And his point was children had a childhood. That was the first time we created space for them not to have to work in the factories. But now today our children don't have childhood because they're getting access to all the same data, content, headlines that we as adults are. So as you have young children, I'm sure those are the things on your mind. Like, how am I going to give these children space for their imagination to grow?
It's true. Of all the things that have happened in the last 25 years, the kind of I don't want to say the pollution of childhood is the one that concerns me the most. So when you talk, and you must know this too, you talk to anyone who is involved with college kids, and they'll tell you, I was having a conversation with someone who was a dean at a college and had been there for 30 years, and he was saying the difference between his job 30 years ago and now is night and day. And that he used to be someone who gave academic advice. He's a guy who lived, he lives in the dorm, right, with the kids. He used to be a kind of like genial father figure who helped kids with their, choose their courses. And he says now he's a full-time mental health counselor. And the idea that college has gone from, which used to be this kind of place you went to experience the first thrill of freedom and discover the world of ideas and expand your social circle and kind of fill your life with excitement. The idea that that's gone from that to a place of anxiety and neuroses is just heartbreaking to me.
Do you think the device has been the main catalyst for that?
I did a podcast on a guy named Matt Scogan, who is the president of Hope College, which is a Christian college in Western Michigan, and who I think is one of the most impressive educational leaders I've ever met. And he's the one who has been leading this movement to, he wants to move college to a pay-it-forward model where you go for free and you give back over the course of your life to pay for the next generation coming up. But apart from that, if you asked him that question, what he would say is that it is the job of the university, of the educational institution, to provide a sense of purpose to the students, and that schools have neglected that. And his whole point is, what does it mean to have a kind of Christian mission in the world? That needs to be concrete and defined.
Yeah.
And so his answer to that is, at this institution, what it means is we remove the economic burden from people who want to come here. Right? That's his. Now, he doesn't say that everyone should have that definition, but he says that's what we stand for here. And his argument would be, you come to my place, you understand what that mission is, and you participate in that mission, and that is a way to give your time at this college and the years you spend afterwards, after you graduate, meaning.
Yeah.
And when I look at all this anxiety among kids, what I see is a lack of meaning.
Right.
That's the core of it. When you're on the problem with the phone is this metaphor for that, because the phone offers you no guideposts at all. It's just undifferentiated information given to kids who have, who are trying to establish some kind of structure in their life, and this is unstructured knowledge. It's the worst thing for that moment.
Mm-hmm. We, as an organization through THINQ, have created a digital fast opportunity. So we have hundreds of churches at the beginning of the new year and even in the spring that are going to literally, as a collective movement, so playing off of Jonathan Haidt's concept, and we've had him in our conversations with it, are going to have entire families and congregations go through a fast for 28 days where they actually take the device and turn it into a utility device instead of a distraction device. Yeah. So remove the apps that distract, keep the ones on you actually have to use to get around the world or get on the airplane. But actually, as a family, go through it together, because his thesis that these are collective problems we solve collectively. Like no one on their own will probably be able to do this. Like your teenager's probably not going to be able to do it well unless the whole school's doing it, or all her friends are doing it, or she sees the parents doing it. And so it's been really exciting to see the uptake on that, because people's soul is longing for it. They don't know what to do. And when you kind of offer a good solution, like, hey, let's do 28 days together as a community and give them a guide to do it, they're jumping on board with it.
I love that. But to go back to that point I was making about Matt Scoggin, if you're going to do that, you also have to have a clear sense of why we're doing it. There must be purpose behind it.
That's right. Yeah.
It's got to be clear. All right, so I'm taking away your phone, and in its place, we are going to try and accomplish.
Yeah, we're giving them a guide, like literally every day they go through, that actually gets them outside into creation, gets them working with their hands, gets them to experience wonder again and have conversations as a family. And so there's a lot of ways to not just walk away from something, but to your point, like we're walking towards a better life. And what we've seen in the ones that we've already done is people come back and they have a different relationship with their device. They go, I don't want to go back to what that was like. And, but these are things that take a long time to settle in. I want to get into some of the ideas you talk about in your book related to some new terms that I hadn't heard before, overstories. Could you describe for people what an overstory is?
Yeah, so this is an idea that I've become really fascinated with. And it started with this observation, it actually comes from the world of medicine, which was people who study healthcare noticed this thing about 30 years ago, which is that when you went from one community to another, anywhere in the world, but let's just use the US for example, what you discovered was doctors behaved in fundamentally different ways in one town versus another town. And the towns could be side by side. That you could have two identical towns 10 miles apart, and in one town, the doctor takes out all the kids' tonsils, and the other town, they don't, right? Yeah. Really basic stuff, hugely different. And that's an idea that they call small area variation, which is that, you have a modern profession and you assume that everyone all over the country behaves in the same way, but no, there's massive local variation. And their explanation of why that is that doctors are part of communities, and communities have stories they tell each other about what it means to be a good doctor, or what it means to practice effective medicine. Or there are these common narratives, and they're powerful and they're unseen. And so I sort of took this idea and started to say, you can see this. I have a whole chapter on Miami, and there's a weird thing about how Miami rates of Medicare fraud in Miami are like way higher than anywhere else in the country. And it's not all of Florida, and it's not even Boca and Fort Lauderdale. It's just Miami. They have a story in Miami that's specific to Miami that appears to affect the way people behave who are involved with Medicare, right? Medicare, by the way, Medicare fraud is one of the biggest problems this country has. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem. So we're not talking about something minor here. But it made me, so building up from there, it made me realize that we sometimes, I think, in the modern world, fall into the trap of thinking that we're now all common creatures of the same culture. And that ultimately we all, that in an age in a digital world where everything is borderless, and that's just couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, what we're seeing in an age of this kind of borderless technology is the emergence of incredibly strong local cultures that are fueled by stories, the stories we tell each other. And, families have common stories, especially when they're strong families. Companies have common stories. Churches have common stories. Towns have common stories. And I think we need to pay attention to what those stories are. So, I just was talking about that guy. I keep coming back to Matt Scogan. I love Matt Scogan. He's a guy who realized this. I'm the president of a small college. I have a chance to build a narrative about what this college is. And if I do that, it's going to matter. Kids are going to come here and they're going to pick up on that story, and it's going to change the way they see their life. And I think that people who are leaders need to be really, really intentional about what their story is. And I don't think we should be prescriptive. It's not like this is what your story should be. I think you need to figure out what it is and articulate it. And any number of, if you think about colleges, I can think of 100 different incredibly effective stories that a college could tell. I mean, imagine a college that said, our story is that we serve our community. Or our story is we're going to produce the most brilliant scientists. I mean,
right.
That's what Caltech has, right? They have a story in place. But I mean, you could go on. Our story, but having that kind of identity just is so crucial, I think, for helping people understand their place in the world.
Yeah, it's good. So for leaders, as you're describing, I mean, this role that they play in shaping a narrative, coming up with the narrative, but then driving that home over many, many years starts to play out in all the people that they're leading, right? And they start to live out that narrative. It is local, and and you start to see the impact pop up in different places. I loved in the book how you shared that. You talked about the Waldorf schools in particular as one example of families that all sort of had a certain view about childhood vaccines and how they were going to take those. But how much, it's like once a family kind of moved into that social space, they were shaped by it.
Yeah.
You talk about the magic thirds as a number. I'd love for you to describe that and give people a little bit of an understanding of when you move into a social group, for example, the Waldorf schools, let's say, is there a certain number of people that have to have the same opinion, the same view, the same story that they're telling to then have the whole group opt into that story? Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, and this comes up in a number of different contexts, but if you think back to, I started this discussion back in the 50s when so many American cities were undergoing white flight. Black families were moving in, and by the hundreds of thousands, white families moved out of urban areas. And the question that came up back then is, if you are a largely white neighborhood, if one black family moves in, that doesn't, not all the whites should move out when one black family moves in. There seems to be a point when the number of newcomers reaches a certain threshold when everyone else decides we're out of here, right? There are tipping points in groups. And subsequently, that work was kind of reframed when people were thinking about when they were bringing women into organizations, in the workforce, that had previously been all male. And you bring one woman in, what happens to that woman? Well, she has a very hard time, right? Because she's entering a place with an all-male culture. And so the question is, how many women do you need to bring in before the women who are the newcomers feel at home, before they start to change and affect the culture of the group they're joining? And the answer to all of these questions seems to be somewhere around between a quarter and a third is when newcomers change the organization they're joining. When you start to see when the newcomers feel they can be themselves, and when the culture starts to adapt in the face of the newcomers. And I think that's really an interesting because it got me, I've become very interested in diversity in its broadest sense. Part of, I think, what makes, particularly say, if you think about schools, what makes, or organizations, what makes them effective and alive and open to new ideas is to have true intellectual diversity, where people from all kinds of backgrounds, different experiences can contribute to it. So the question is, how do you define that? And I think that knowing that there are these thresholds, group thresholds, and knowing that when people come to represent a third of the overall group, something in the dynamic changes, is really an effective tool to think about how you kind of alter the culture of a group.
Yeah.
I had these fascinating conversations with women on boards, and I was talking to these women who were like on the boards of Fortune 500 companies, and I found someone who, and she starts out and she's the only woman on the board. I was like, how is that? People acted like I didn't exist, right? Then another woman would join the board. What would happen? I mean, it was a little bit better, but still, it was like, I felt weird. No one listened to me, whatever. You got 3 women on the board. What happened? Boom. Changes.
Yeah.
Right? All of a sudden, we're no longer anomalies. We're part of the conversation. We feel like we're contributing. We feel like we're being seen. We're no longer tokens. Like that's really interesting to me about what it means to build teams that kind of truly reflect a variety of viewpoints.
The other idea that you play out is the rise of social engineering. That's part of your subtitle of your book. I'm curious, do you have a stance on social engineering? Like, morally, is social engineering a net negative in a society, that there are people trying to figure out how to move people certain directions and to manipulate the way people think and the way that they're going to operate? Or is that one of those things that can also be a net positive? It's really almost just a way sociology works.
I think, so when I'm talking about what I just was talking about with how something kind of magical happens in a group when outsiders reach a third, understanding that kind of process and the presence of that kind of tipping point within a group and using it for good is social engineering, right? If you have a leadership team which is overwhelmingly male and you think you would benefit from having women on that team, understanding that you got to have them in sufficient numbers for it to be meaningful, to make a meaningful difference. You should use those principles to guide the way you reshape the team. That is social engineering. But in that sense, it's more than benign. It's a force for good. You're trying to intentionally bring about a change in the way the group operates. It can also be a force for a negative force. I have a chapter on the way I love beating up on Ivy League schools, but I have a chapter on how I think Harvard and other Ivy League schools use sports to make sure they have sufficient numbers of privileged kids at their school, in a way that in a way that troubles me. I don't think that's. I think if you're an elite school, you have an obligation to be meritocratic, and you should not be. My argument was they're playing games with rowing and sailing and
rugby,
and,
women's rugby,
and fencing and all these ridiculous country club sports, and they're setting aside admission slots and lowering their admission standards for kids who play that sports just as a way to make sure they maintain their kind of cultural privilege at the school, and that's not right. That's I find that. Really troubling. So it just depends on what your
it depends on the morality of the social engineer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is where we have to make judgments about our leaders, about who they are, about their virtue. And I noticed in the book, you tell a lot of these stories, and I know, as I curate content or events, there's a story I'm telling through who we're talking to, what we're talking about, and you do that. But you lay back a little bit in making moral judgments. I mean, I don't pick up that you're trying to say something and you're not trying to swing a big stick and say, hey, here's what's so awful about that. You let the story kind of do the work. Is that just part of how you've come to write and think about how change happens? We don't need to be so demonstrative. If we just put the stories, the truth in front of people genuinely come to good conclusions? Well,
that's a big difference between the books I write now and my thinking 25 years ago, and that I've come to know my audience really well, and I have enormous faith in them, and I also respect that there are many ways to interpret the stories I tell, and it's not my job to dictate one interpretation over, to privilege one interpretation over another. My job is just to give people ideas and the sort of raw material for making sense of their world.
Yeah.
And I always tell a story. I was in a coffee shop in Houston, in a very wealthy part of Houston, and this woman drives up in a Range Rover, with pearls and the whole thing. She comes in and she looks at me. She goes, "Are you Malcolm Gladwell?" I said, "Yes." She goes, "I have read everything you've ever written, and I disagree with everything you ever said." And I just thought, I love that. I thought it was beautiful. Like, I really did. She was like, I'm not reading you to adopt your positions. I don't share your positions. I'm reading you because I find what you write interesting. It challenges me, and I'm going to make use of it however I make use of it. Yeah. And to me, she's my ideal. I wanted to hug her. I was like, you're my ideal reader. You're an independent, thoughtful person.
Yeah.
Making sense of your world, and you find me enjoyable company. That's great.
Are you concerned that we're losing a bit of that ability to critically think as you think about younger generations, the environments that we're in, where algorithms are doing a lot of work to shape thinking, and people aren't necessarily hunting down original sources or maybe reading as much as they once did? Do you have concerns that we're losing something in our humanity because of that?
Well, I think what we're losing, I think we have become over-ideologized, and so we have difficulty seeing things outside of a kind of ideological prism, and that worries me because only a small number of things are usefully viewed through an ideological prism, and along with that, and what happens when you have that very narrow way of making sense of the world is you stop listening to people. And this kind of listening failure is something I've gotten kind of obsessed with. And it's funny, I was in Atlanta yesterday. I was chatting with this guy who was a dean at Emory, and I said, "You know what? I want to teach. I want to come to Emory at some point in my life because I love Atlanta." So I was like trying to angle a way of hanging out in Atlanta. So I want to come to Emory and I want to teach a course on listening. I have all these ideas about how you would do it. I said, back in the day, I wanted to teach a course on writing. I no longer want to teach a course on writing because I think that's too late. Writing is really just writing begins with listening. And if you don't know how to listen, you can't write, right? Writing's really easy when you know how to listen because you understand somebody, and then you're just putting it on the page. But if it's people who have struggled with writing aren't listening. They're not. The people they're gathering information from, they're not doing a good job of understanding what they're doing, so they're confused when it comes down to putting it down on paper. And I think we're really bad at listening. And one of the reasons we're bad at listening is that we've got too many of these kinds of barriers we put up.
Yeah.
I make a prediction. I think, oh, you're going off in that direction. I'm not listening to you. Who knows what,
Right.
If I just kept going with you and kept asking questions, maybe what I would discover is, you're going off on a little tangent, and we're going to end up someplace where we really understand each other, not agree with each other, where we understand each other.
Right.
Yeah. Where I understand where you're coming from and what your perspective is, but you have to commit to listening first, and I think people are bad listening.
Well, my marriage counselor, that was one of the things he first communicated to Rebecca and I, which is, most people think the breakdown of marriage is lack of good communication, and it's actually lack of mutual understanding.
Yeah.
that there's not the time to really understand what the person was trying to say and to practice empathy and to actively listen and disarm. There's so many of these skills. It does feel like it's not being modeled. I mean, where are we supposed to watch this happen in a way that's, when an attention span's like 7 seconds, it's not that entertaining to watch people sit and have conversations like this. And so it feels like even the mediums by which we're gaining content and information have changed so much. It's going to be a bit of work to try to stir that part of our imagination back up. But I think conversations like this, I hope help that. I want to run by you kind of how we're trying to teach people how to think through THINQ. So I'm going to tell you the rubric, and I want you to. It's a risk because I don't know what your response is going to be to our way of helping.
I will listen.
And we're trying to help young Christians, especially Gen Z, who are coming up to understand what does it mean to think as a Christian, and that the T stands for theology. So let's start with, what does God say about a matter? What does he say about this issue? Does he speak to this issue? How's the church thought about this over time? So we start there. We think that's the first and foundational point. The H stands for history. So let's understand a history of events and ideas. Not a lot of new ideas under the sun. So let's understand what surrounds it. The I stands for inquiry, which is curiosity, which is let's learn from other sources. It's not just Christians you should listen to. You should listen to people who've written on this, thought about this maybe more than you have. They have a lot to add. And then the N gets more to posture, which is nuance. So now you're going to engage those ideas with people that disagree. How can you learn to listen well? If you're going to ever persuade someone to think perhaps the way you think, it's going to take a lot of sensitivity in how to have the conversation. And then finally we get to Q, which is question, which is we ask hopefully a better question than perhaps the world's asking about a particular topic because we've put it through that lens. How does that strike you as a method for how a person of Christian faith ought to think?
I like the idea of, just to address the first two, that theology and history belong together.
Yeah.
Our understanding about what Jesus was saying, what he meant, the implication of his teaching, is grounded in our experience as a civilization, right? What's gone on over the issues he was wrestling with 2,000 years ago he was responding very much to his time and place. So let's understand what his time and place was about. So I love that starting on those 2 points, and also which immediately takes us out of, I think the first step in teaching someone to effectively think is to put themselves aside for a moment, right? So when you go to theology and history, you've taken yourself out of the equation. And I think that's important as a place to start. We must put ourselves back in eventually, but I think we short circuit when we get too caught up in where I am right now in this moment. No, you've got to in my listening course that I want to teach, when it comes time for people to kind of explain what they've been listening to, one of my rules is going to be you can't use I. Okay, we'll get there. But for the moment, just step outside of yourself and allow and experience the freedom that comes with that.
Yeah,
right? That's
good.
And so that's why I think that's why I love the way that your rubric starts.
Yeah. I'm curious, the stories you chose, and you talked about OxyContin, you talked about, the rugby team and Harvard. You chose a bunch of different stories to try to, I think, explain how social engineering has gone poorly in some of these situations, which is, I think, the point of your book, right? The revenge of the tipping point. When it's in the hands of the wrong people, this can go badly. There's a lot of stories you didn't tell that you probably could have. You could talk about healthcare. We could talk about food, big food. There's a lot of things I feel like in the moment we're in, people are getting awakened to the way some actors have corrupted our institutions and our systems, and they're not working for people. So how do you choose, when you're curating these stories, which ones you were going to focus on and which ones maybe you're safe for another day?
Well, I often think my role, I don't want to be duplicative. So I don't talk at all about, for example, social media in the book. Not because I think it's unimportant, but because I feel like you mentioned Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah.
Really, really smart people have written really, really good books on that subject. and there's no point in me kind of going over ground that.
Yeah.
So I wanted very deliberately to choose areas that are new, and also I think it's very important. I've always tried to not to land in one ideological camp or another, and
is that for the benefit of your readers and your audience, or
I don't want to get typecast. I don't want to be dismissed by people.
Yeah.
I don't want to be, and I think there's so much. I've always said this. Whenever I had a conversation with a guy, I was speaking at some event. Some guy comes up to me and he's like, "I really like your books, although I suspect our politics are really different." And I said to him, "Are you sure?"
right?
So I said, "Let's talk." I was like, "Let's talk about what we think the most important issues are." And we had this conversation for about 10 minutes. And he was like, "Actually, we actually don't disagree on all that much, Malcolm." And it was just like, there's some stuff I suspect we probably did, I'm Canadian, so I don't vote, but I'm not sure we would always vote the same way in an election. But in our conversation, we very quickly came to the realization that that's a tiny part of who we are.
Yeah.
And that actually we had way more in common than we. He was, for example, a business guy who believed very strongly that the best solution to a number of problems lies in the ingenuity of business leaders, and that a goal of society should be to free up that ingenuity. Could not agree with him more. And I think about that in very, very concrete ways. If I have to define, when I think about what is government's role, it is to remove obstacles and encourage people who have imagination and want to solve problems. And we could sit, and I was with this guy, he was in healthcare, and we were talking about, what does that mean in your world? And we agreed on so much.
Yeah.
And it was this kind of, he was a little bit, at the end of the conversation, I don't think anyone had that conversation with him before in that way. And I feel like my role is to have that kind of conversation. Is to say, actually, we're not divided. It's just a kind of, that's just an illusion that comes from having a way too narrow a lens on who we are.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like, the data shows that we have a lot more in common, and we probably agree on so much more than what it would appear like, especially now, again, with the social media.
Once you have kids, you just agree on everything. That's the thing I've discovered.
Yeah.
Is the universe, I'm an older father. I waited a long time to have kids. Well, I just realized the universe of people with kids is like, you're all worried about the same things.
Right.
And you're going through exactly the same experiences.
Right.
And I always joke that this is the first in my kind of, as parent, in my parent world, is the first time in my life where everything I have ever said or thought or believed about my kids has been said, thought, or believed by every other parent ever. Going back, there is no original thought you can have as a parent.
Yeah.
It's all everyone's already, which is so fantastic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
No parent ever has said to you when you relate some crazy story about your kids. No one ever says, "Oh my God, that happened to you." Never. They always say, "Of course."
Right.
Yeah, I remember.
Right.
I remember when that. Right.
Yeah.
It's that reminder that we're all in the same boat. It's beautiful. Right.
How do you think being a parent has changed you? I mean, you certainly know you have a lot in common with a lot of other parents, but how did it work on your heart?
Oh man, it breaks your heart, mashes it up, it expands it. It's all that matters after a while. I'm the guy who's showing people pictures of my kids every 5 minutes. It's just it just has turned on a part of my.
You don't know it exists till it happens, right?
That you didn't. It's wonderful. I can't believe I waited so long.
As you look into this future, no one has the crystal ball, but there seems to be a lot of concern from parents who have young children about the kind of world they're walking into. When you think about these ideas about Revenge of the Tipping Point, or how we're going to get the right ideas moving instead of the bad ideas, are you hopeful about the future? Are you fearful? Is fear even a part of your vocabulary, or
a little bit? So my best friend has a 16-year-old son, and I had a long chat with my friend recently about his son, who's a really interesting kid, and my friend said of his son, he feels robbed because he feels like he's growing up in a world where he has nothing to believe in, where people have taken away everything that you had, that you had faith in, everything that was solid, every institution has been torn down, and he said my son feels adrift and he's looking for something real, and he's like, my son is so much more, for example, socially conservative than I am. He's like, because he's just looking for something solid, and that really worried me. The idea that you could be 16 right now, well, my kids are much younger than that, and be a really smart, thoughtful 16-year-old, and just say, where is certainty in my world? That really worries me.
Yeah, we do a lot of work with the next gen, and it's been actually so encouraging to be around Gen Z and in the spaces we're in and creating for them. There's a lack of baggage, I find, that they don't have what you and I have, which is we have a memory of life a different way, and they really don't. This has all been very normal for them. So while it's been depressing or they're not finding meaning and purpose, there's also a part of them that's saying we can change this. We can create a better world. We don't want to live the way you guys have been living, and we want to do something about it. And again, when you were in your 20s or 30s, right, you thought the progress was possible. So perhaps it's naivety, but I think what we're finding is, I don't know if you've interacted with the ideas from the Fourth Turning or the Fourth Turning is Here, Neil Howe, he talks about these 80-year increments in history where there's a great civilizational crisis, and then he builds this model of 4 archetypes that come out of that generationally. Well, he would describe Gen Z as the hero generation, that they're the generation that's actually going to rebuild the institutions when we go through this dramatic shift we're right in the middle of. And that we should be encouraging them and coaching them and helping them start to see what is the kind of world you want to create, because you are going to be in position, to create it. And I think when I think about it that way, I'm hopeful. I'm excited about that future, even though none of us want to walk through crisis and change. There are things I think that we can be excited about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I love that. I love that paradigm, because there is a great deal of hopefulness in it. I have the kind of standard set of worries that have to do with a lot of my worries have to do with work. Like so much of people of my generation, my parents were born in the Depression, right? And my parents were the first generation in their family to have, they were middle class, right? But affluence, they were more affluent than anyone who came before them. And I am more affluent than my parents' generation. But we had anxieties about affluence, right? My parents could remember when they were wanting. And that kind of was an enormous motivator in their life. And I have an awareness of, I grew up in a household where the lack of money was a kind of constant, like so many. I mean, like 90% of people of my generation was a constant theme. And then we now have a generation where an enormous number of kids did not grow up in households where anxieties about affluence were central. And I guess I don't know what that looks like, how that affects work ethic, how you have to find a substitute source of meaning in your work if you're no longer being driven by kind of material need. In some ways, growing up in an affluent society makes your life a little harder. You got to work harder to, my father could feel satisfaction, although he loved his job, but he could feel satisfaction simply as being the breadwinner.
Right.
Right. Well, if you've removed that source of satisfaction, and your job is not inherently interesting as his was, what happens? I don't know.
Right. because work is, I believe, by design, by God. It's like part of how we find our meaning and purpose. And even working with our hands and doing physical labor and work, I think a lot of young men are starting to experience that. And they're like, man, I grew up on a laptop on my device. Like when I get out in nature, I feel something different in my DNA, and it comes alive that we start to lose in the digital age. And with AI, obviously when we look at the future of the job market, there's dramatic shifts that could be coming.
This worries me a little. Maybe I'm overly, but I was just at a conference with a whole group of CIOs from Fortune 500 companies, and man, there's some massive changes happening.
Yeah, I was with the CEO today at lunch telling me that he had a 2,500 employee workplace, and he cut 1,000 jobs in the last year just because of technology, right? And it's real, and it's coming fast. When you think about meaning and purpose, I know that 16-year-old comes to mind. What role do you think faith communities and religion historically has played in providing that sense of meaning and purpose in someone's life? And as we go through an age where we're finding the youngest generations essentially not adopting a religion and walking away from that in the largest numbers we've seen in American life, how big of a role would seeing faith become more a part of people's lives play in providing that meaning and purpose?
Yeah, I think huge. There's the paradox of what's happening right now in religious circles is I feel like people are abandoning faith at exactly the moment when I would argue that it's more important than ever. A lot of what we're talking about is traditional sources of meaning are kind of either evaporating or very rapidly evolving. And in that kind of situation, you need more, like that 16-year-old son of my friend, you need more than ever something of substance to organize your life around. When everything else is in flux, there's got to be a rock, right? And this has been a rock of our, for thousands of years, and with good reason. So I feel like this is, there's on the upside, there is an opportunity, I think, for the world of faith now that maybe didn't even exist, 10, 15 years ago before this kind of. But that story about the guy cutting 1,000 jobs out of 2,500 is kind of a little. Yeah. It's a little haunting.
Well, we're seeing it on college campuses, and I'm not talking Christian colleges. We're talking state schools. Right now there's a movement called Unite that's been going to these schools, creating an evening event, taking over the arena, sharing the message of Jesus to this arena that's voluntary, thousands of students showing up, and hundreds to thousands are becoming Christians. They're converting on their state school campus, going to the fountains nearby for baptisms. It's radical what's happening in, again, Gen Z, that I think is birthing out of this desire to have meaning and purpose. They're like, I'm done with the answers people have tried to tell me would work. And I do think we're coming to the end of like a secularist age where even those who've really bought into kind of the new atheism are starting to come to the ends of some of that and going, hey, this isn't working out so well. And so as you describe that opportunity, I would say we're sensing and seeing that in the work we do too. Well, final thoughts. Let's leave on an encouraging note. You end your book on an encouraging note that, look, everybody can make a difference. Would you just share with our listeners why each of us continue to move forward wherever we're at, wherever we're called, whatever locale we're in, matters?
Yeah, so, there's many different ways to answer that question, but we were talking earlier about, for example, these overstories, this idea that there are these common narratives that define communities and that affect our behavior and the behavior of those in the communities in ways that are really important and often unseen. And I think if you think about overstories, an overstory is something that affects everyone in a community. Everyone in a community can contribute to it, can embody it, can work towards changing it when it's important. Values that kind of acting out a common set of values is deeply contagious. I mean, that's really, this book is about epidemics in many ways. And the reason I'm so focused on epidemics is that I do believe behavior in some level is powerfully contagious.
Yeah.
And the common stories we tell, the reason they are common is that when groups of people embody them, other people get infected by that idea in a beautiful and positive way. And, any kind of contagion model, implicates us all. It says we're all part of this in this kind of wonderful and important way.
Yeah.
And so I think, understanding that fact, I think gives meaning to what everyone is everyone's path in the world.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you for taking time to just sit down and talk with us and share your ideas. And we're looking forward to continuing to follow your work, and blessings on you.
Thank you, Gabe.